The pandemic and its economic fallout have placed new strains on the state budget. Along with more urgent needs for spending, there's also less revenue. In a revised budget, Governor Baker recently announced plans for an overall spending increase without additional broad-based taxes. But the Mass Budget and Policy Center says the revision falls short as a response to urgent needs and in terms of tapping potential sources of revenue. To explain is the center's president, Marie Francis Rivera. Thank you very much for being with us, Marie Francis.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. And yes, that the intro that you gave is precisely, it's on point. So, it's essentially basic math, and we know right now that communities are hurting. And, we might not all see it because, we're living a middle-class life, but there are folks all around the state that are on the verge of becoming homeless or homeless. There's food insecurity that's rampant across the state. And we really feel like the budget that Governor Baker has proposed, although he's done a fine job of sort of limiting cuts, doesn't rise to the level of the needs that we're seeing across the state.
Let me ask you for a little more clarification, because in addition to just responding to a crisis, you want this to be a budget that advances racial and economic justice. So what's missing in terms of that?
Sure. So we knew that even before the pandemic in Massachusetts and in Boston, there are class and race divides that were extremely deep. If you look across education, if you look across housing, if you look across employment opportunities, et cetera. So, we always at Mass Budget are aiming for the public good to really help repair some of those damages and some of those fissures. Now that we have the COVID crisis overlaid on top of that, we're just seeing these things, a lot of people use this term, but laid bare. You really are seeing the exposure of the underfunding and the underinvestment that's happening in communities. So really, the things that we're calling for, things that we've been calling for a while, but the urgency is increasing. We know, especially now, that school districts across the Commonwealth, we see it in Boston as well, are really needing resources in order to really make sure that they can provide socially distanced, whatever that means to a particular family at a particular time, education. And all of this just requires resources in order to, especially in communities that are under-resourced. If you're living in a household with, you have multiple siblings, and you're sharing one tablet, or your internet connection is unstable, or whatever the challenges are, there really need to be resources there to support students, to support families. And that's just kind of one example of some of the resources that are needed.
Well, the way the governor's administration describes the revised budget is that they're increasing the Chapters 70 funding for education. But on the other hand, if you look at this from another angle, there seems to be a sort of a retreat from what people were trying to do coming in at the beginning of this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's, I think the administration, the legislature, and we've been challenged by the numbers, because we have been fortunate enough to get some federal funding through the CARES Act and through some other federal legislation. So there is money coming in from the federal government to support school districts to provide socially distanced education. So that's true. But the thing that we have to realize that is, we don't know when the next big federal stimulus package is going to come. So these federal supports that are coming in to, help with mass health, help with our school districts and providing PPE and all these things, there's a limited runway for those things. So we also have to think long-term about how we're going to support schools, et cetera. If there is no more, who knows when the next federal stimulus package is going to come down. So we have to, in Massachusetts, we're a wealthy state. So we are in a fortunate place that we do have resources here that we are able to put forth and to figure out how to solve some problems here within our, 300.
One other revision that's more urgent is the additional $171 million for the governor's Eviction Diversion program. I think he says he's open to increasing that if need be, but what should he be saying and putting into the budget right now for that?
Mm-hmm. So there's a massive housing emergency crisis that's happening right now. And, we've been working with partners grassroots advocates, other policy shops, MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, estimates that there's a need for $117 million a month to support folks with rental assistance. So the 171 that the governor proposed really falls short of meeting the needs in our housing crisis that we're seeing.
What about tapping new revenue? Because it just seems to be a tough time to look for new revenue anyhow, but do you see anything out there that would not be too painful or that might threaten recovery in some way?
Sure. So, I mean, and that's sort of the framework that we're always using. It's, we at Mass Budget, we think it's unwise to, especially during a time like this, to be taxing everyday folks more. And we're seeing that even during this pandemic, we have very wealthy folks in our state, a good handful of billionaires in our state that have made $17 billion since the pandemic struck. So there is economic activity moving in Massachusetts. And it's sort of, what's a way that we can all benefit from that growth so that as a Commonwealth and city of Boston, we can move forward equitably and make sure that we aren't continuing to leave people behind. So there are sort of revenue policies that we have proposed that we've talked about, with our partners in the legislature. We've talked about it with, our business, community to say, does this make sense? What are the pros and cons of moving to, tax multinational corporations that are making profits at this time? What would that look like? Who would that impact and how could it benefit the Commonwealth? So we have several proposals. We have another proposal to increase the corporate income tax, which essentially by 1.5 percentage points, which would essentially just hit corporations who are profitable at this time. And so, we're looking at fairness. We're looking at trying to, fix our tax system that's always been upside down and really does hurt low-income folks, but we need those resources now more than ever.
One of the proposals is to increase the taxes on mutual fund companies based in Massachusetts. I guess currently they're just taxed on sales in Massachusetts as opposed to being here and having a payroll here. But if you tax the location and the payroll more, wouldn't that maybe be an incentive for them to go somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, so what we like to say is that, the rate in which corporations or businesses are taxed are a very, very small percentage of the cost that they incur. So really, most corporations aren't making location-based decisions on slight increases in taxes based on the research that we've done and sort of the activity that we've seen. It's quite a small percentage of kind of their overall costs, these tax increases. And honestly, with the single sales factor that you're talking about, there are only, a small subset of industries that get that tax break essentially. So it would be restoring fairness to other sectors to have, corporations, no matter what the sector, be taxed on all of their economic activity. So,
of course, the other thing that people are really struggling with right now are the advantages of cuts versus the advantages of higher taxes. Because yes, taxes can be a burden, but what about the burden of cuts? How does that weigh in?
Sure. So I could just sort of give you an example. Well, when we talk about cuts, really what we're talking about is cutting folks' jobs in the public sector. So if you talk about cuts to education, you're talking about cutting either support staff or cutting teachers. If you're talking about cuts to health and human services, you're talking about, cutting caseworkers and other folks that are really out there in the community, part of the community, helping folks. So really how we like to look at it is to say, stopping these cuts are actually keeping folks employed and keeping money flowing through our economy. And the folks whose jobs will be kept by not making these cuts or perhaps added are folks that are really going out and spending and supporting their local communities actively, regularly each day.
By the way, one other area where I think there's a lot of concern about the price of cuts, and that is with the MBTA, because people rely on that to go to work or go to school. The T is running out of money, so what should be done about that?
So, I think this is really complicated because if you remember, Chris, even pre-pandemic, we were talking about making investments in the T and sort of restructuring the T. And I saw Secretary Pollock speak recently where she basically talked about needing to completely rethink the way that we do transportation in the state. And I think that's right. Of course, we don't want any cuts to fall disproportionately in communities with essential workers that are really relying on some of these like trains and buses to move around. We don't want to cut services in communities that really need it. But we also have to think about, maybe there are places that we can consolidate, but also we have to think about what investments do we want for the future, right? We were talking about pre-pandemic sort of expanding the commuter rail lines so that they would hit all portions of the state to make this really a regional economy. So how can we start, yes, thinking about consolidations maybe in places where public transportation isn't being used as actively, but then how can we make those more long-term investments and start doing that longer-term planning so that when we get to the point of recovery, which we're not at yet, that we have the systems in place so that folks can move around and work and things that they need. And that's saying that for all communities, not just the ones that are able to access the resources now.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It was Marie Frances Rivera from the Mass Budget and Policy Center.